They say the human soul is a fortress, yet even the strongest walls have doors, and some of them open only inward toward the dark. In the year of our Lord 1627, behind the high stone enclosure of a French convent, one such door swung open. A nun, no older than 22, pale as wax and trembling as if the winter had seeped in her very bones, stood before her abbess and claimed what no pious lips should have dared to form into words. She was with child, she said, and the father was no man. It was the devil himself. The air in that chamber did not move. A crucifix hung crooked on the wall, its carved Christ staring not at her, but downward, as if unwilling to meet her gaze. Her hands, folded at her stomach, pressed against the swell beneath her habit, and though she spoke softly, her words reached the furthest corners of the room like the tolling of an iron bell. We imagine history as a pageant of reason, but this was a world in which shadows could touch you back, in which sin was not merely disobedience, but a living, breathing force, eager to claw its way into flesh. For the women of the cloister, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a prowler in the corridors of the mind, the tempter who could slip through the narrowest cracks between prayer and doubt. And now, if this nun was to be believed, he had crossed the last boundary, the threshold of her own body. Why would she say such a thing? Was it a desperate lie to hide the sin of an earthly lover? Or a cry from a mind fraying under the weight of isolation, fasting, and the constant pounding of the soul's own heartbeat in the echoing silence of the cloister? Or was it, though we shrink from the thought, something else entirely? Something that required no human accomplice? The world beyond the convent walls would not take such a claim lightly. The 17th century was an age poised between two realities. One foot still in the medieval night of saints and devils, the other inching into the dawn of reason. The printing press carried new ideas like wildfire, but superstition still ran in the veins of kings and peasants alike. And in France, the church's grip on the imagination of the people was ironclad. To accuse the devil was to accuse the very enemy that gave the church its holy war, the shadow that defined the light. It was not the first time such a scandal had erupted. In Loudun, a few years before, an entire convent of Ursuline nuns had claimed to be possessed, convulsing and screaming in front of crowds, their accusations tearing apart a local priest's life and leading him to the stake. But here, in this smaller and quieter place, there was only one voice making the claim, and that perhaps made it more dangerous. For a solitary witness is either a lone prophet or a lone liar, and in either case, she must be silenced or proven. Picture the candlelit refectory where the other sisters whispered over their bread, casting furtive glances toward her empty seat. Imagine the abbess, pacing in the night, torn between fear for her charge's soul and fear for the scandal that could ruin them all. Think of the priest sent to hear her confession, his hand tightening on the rosary as her words tangled with scripture and blasphemy alike. There is a strange thing about stories like this. They are not content to stay within the mouths of those who first speak them. They crawl outward, slip through cracks, find listeners who will feed them. Within days, the townsfolk outside the convent's gates knew something was amiss. The baker's wife said she had seen the nun's face in a dream, pale and weeping, while behind her stood a figure whose hands ended in claws. A child claimed he had heard strange music coming from the convent after Compline. The blacksmith swore the air felt heavier on the road that passed by its walls. Every detail added to the sense that something had taken root here, something that could not be explained away by hunger, illness, or boredom. And yet, for those who dealt daily in the care of souls, there was a more intimate terror, the possibility that she told the truth. The church taught that the devil could assume many forms, that he could tempt not only with wealth or power, but with touch, with a counterfeit tenderness that bound the body in sin as surely as it bound the soul in damnation. There were grim precedents, whispers of incubus visitations, of women waking in the dark to feel the weight of an unseen figure pressing them down. Learned men wrote treatises on how to detect such deceptions, warning that the evil one could even disguise himself in the shape of a familiar face, a loved one, or, most dangerously, an angel. And if such a being could deceive the senses, what hope had a cloistered nun, fasting in the cold stone belly of a convent, cut off from all but the same 40 faces and the same 40 prayers? In the stillness, in the long nights of vigil, might she not feel the difference between dream and visitation begin to blur? But here was the problem. Her words carried consequence. If her claim was false, she was guilty not only of fornication, but of blasphemy, heresy, and deceit, a trifecta of sins that could damn her in the eyes of the church and the law alike. If her claim was true, she was not merely a victim, but a living battlefield in the eternal war between heaven and hell. In either case, the baby she carried was no ordinary child. The first time a midwife was called to examine her, she refused. "I am no fool," she said. "If this is the devil's doing, then to lay my hands on her is to invite him to see me." Others were not so bold. A physician from a nearest town was summoned, a man of letters who prided himself on his knowledge of Galen and the new medical theories spreading from Italy. He emerged from the convent pale, muttering that her condition was most peculiar and declining to speak further. It is said that from that day forward, the nights grew restless within the cloister. A smell of sulfur was reported in the chapel after matins. The choir's chant faltered when she entered, and once, though no one could agree on the details, a scream was heard in the small hours, sharp enough to draw even the sick from their beds. Though when they reached her cell, she was kneeling in silence before a crucifix, her face blank and her lips moving in a prayer none could hear. We are left with questions, but questions are the devil's favorite terrain. Why her? Why here? Why now? Was this the eruption of something ancient and foul into the neat order of convent life, or the invention of a mind seeking escape, attention, or absolution for some hidden act? And what of the child she claimed to carry? In a time when every birth was a dangerous gamble, this one carried the weight of the supernatural. Would it be a normal infant, wailing and fragile, or would it come into the world marked in some unmistakable way? Claws, teeth, a strange voice, eyes too old for its face? And if such a thing happened, what would the church do? Baptize it? Bury it? Burn it? The nun's name is recorded in only a few surviving documents, and even there, it is half buried under the titles given her by others: accused, blasphemer, penitent. History has a way of turning women into footnotes, especially when their stories challenge the order of the world. But for now, in this moment, she was still alive, still walking the cloister corridors, her every step a ripple in the surface of something deep and unseen. And somewhere in those shadows, truth waited, not in the safety of reason, nor in the wild abandon of superstition, but in that narrow, treacherous space between them where faith and fear become indistinguishable. Before she was the nun whose words cracked the stone shell of the convent. She was simply a child, born into a world where a woman's fate was often decided long before her first breath. The records say she came from a small village, a scattering of thatched roofs and muddy lanes under the shadow of a larger town. Her family was neither rich nor destitute. They lived in the thin space between comfort and hunger, where a bad harvest could strip away years of hard work, and a good one could be swallowed by the tithe collectors before it ever reached their own table. Her father, a man of stern faith and worn hands, believed his daughter's soul was a fragile thing, easily bruised by the chaos of the world. Her mother, quiet, watchful, carried her through the dangers of early childhood with that fierce tenderness common among women who know how easily life can slip away. But from the first, there were whispers that the girl was different. They spoke of her gaze, steady, unblinking, as if she saw something behind the person she was looking at, of how she sometimes spoke in her sleep, murmuring words no one could quite understand. Of the time she wandered into the woods alone at 5 years old, vanishing for hours, only to return at dusk clutching a sprig of herbs that did not grow anywhere nearby. Her mother insisted these were nothing more than childish oddities, but in a village where superstition was as much a part of life as bread and water, Every strange occurrence became another stone in the wall of a reputation. The parish priest noticed her too. He praised her diligence at catechism, her uncanny ability to remember every word of a sermon. Even weeks later, when she sang in church, her voice rose clear and unwavering, a sound so pure it silenced the restless fidgeting of the congregation. He told her father that such gifts should be guarded, shaped by discipline and devotion. And so the idea was planted. Perhaps the cloister would be her fate. But before vows and veils, there was a life lived in the open air. She learned the rhythms of the seasons, the feel of soil under fingernails, the way the sky changed color before storm. She knew the small joys of a shared apple, the thrill of a traveling peddler's arrival, the deep quiet that fell over the village on nights when snow muffled every sound. Yet even in these moments, there was a sense, felt rather than spoken, that she was somehow set apart. When she was 13, an outbreak of fever swept through the region. Her mother fell ill, then her younger brother. She tended to them both, fetching water, wiping sweat from their brows, reciting prayers over and over until her lips cracked. Her brother survived, her mother did not. At the funeral, as the priest's words rose into the cold air, she did not cry. Some said it was strength. Others said it was unnatural. She simply stood, looking at the wooden cross on the grave, as though she could see through it into whatever lay beyond. It was after this that her father began to speak more urgently of the convent. He said it was for her safety, for the good of her soul, but perhaps also to spare himself the daily reminder of her mother's absence. The dowry required was modest, barely enough to repair the convent's roof for another year. A bargain, some called it. A surrender, she may have thought. The convent stood on the edge of a hill, its bell tower visible from the village. The first time she passed through its gates, she felt the weight of them close behind her like the ceiling of a door. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and stone. The voices of the nuns were low, their faces framed by white wimples that gave no hint of hair or ornament. She was given a small cell, a plain wooden bed, a crucifix above the headboard. Her early days were a study in silence and repetition. Rise before dawn. Pray. Work. Pray again. Eat bread and soup in the refectory. Study scripture. Sing in the chapel. Sleep if sleep would come. Time in the cloister was not measured in hours, but in bells, each toll a reminder that life here moved according to a rhythm older than any of them. She adapted quickly, too quickly, some thought. Where other novices struggled with the loss of freedom, she seemed to fold into the convent's life like ink into water. Her voice in the choir was strong, her work at the herb garden precise. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words carried a strange gravity, as though she were quoting something she had read long ago. It was during these early years that the first signs of something unusual began to surface again. Once, in the middle of Compline, she faltered in her chant, her eyes fixed on a dark corner of the chapel. Later she told another novice she had seen a figure standing there, dressed not in the black habit of their order, but in something that shimmered like oil on water. The novice laughed, but the story reached the ears of the abbess, who warned her sternly against visions that might lead her from the path of obedience. Yet visions, if that is what they were, seemed to find her without her seeking them. Dreams that left her trembling in the morning. Sudden chills in the still air of her cell. Words that came to her unbidden during prayer. Words she dared not repeat. She confessed these to the convent's chaplain, who told her such things were temptations, tests sent to strengthen her faith. But she could not shake the feeling that these were not merely tests. They were messages. Her devotion deepened, perhaps as a defense. She fasted more strictly than required, knelt longer in prayer, sought solitude in the gardens after dusk. But solitude has its own dangers. In the long hours when the rest of the convent slept, she would walk the cloister's covered walkways, the echo of her steps the only sound. Sometimes she felt as if someone walked with her just out of sight. When she turned 21, she took her final vows. The veil came down over her hair, and the world outside the convent receded into something half-remembered, like a dream upon waking. She was in the eyes of the church, a bride of Christ. And for a time, it seemed she had found her place. But still, there were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when the boundary between the seen and unseen seemed thinner around her. Once, tending the candles before the statue of the Virgin, she felt a sudden heat against her cheek, as though someone had leaned close to whisper. Another time, while working in the scriptorium, she found herself writing words she did not recall thinking, her pen moving with a strange urgency. Such things might have passed as private oddities, the harmless quirks of a deeply devout soul. But in a world where the devil was believed to prowl not only the wilderness but the corridors of convents, there were signs that could not be ignored forever. And when, one winter morning, she would stand before the abbess with her shocking claim, the seeds of that moment would be traced back here, to a childhood of whispered suspicions, to a young woman's quiet difference, to the unseen companions that seemed to follow her from the world into the cloister. The past does not vanish. It waits, like embers under ash, needing only the right breath of wind to flare again into fire. For her, that wind was already stirring, and the storm it would feed had only just begun to gather. The convent was not merely a building. It was a world entire, sealed off from the ebb and flow of the outside. A self-contained ocean whose tides were set not by the moon, but by the tolling of the bell. From the moment the gates closed behind her, the rhythms of this place became the frame through which she would view the rest of her life. The outside world did not vanish. It became something distant, seen as through a pane of thick, rippled glass. Stone corridors whispered with the footsteps of women who had walked them for decades, their lives measured in the smooth wear of flagstones beneath their feet. The chapel's air smelled always of wax and incense, the fragrance clinging to the skin as if to remind the sisters that here, prayer was not an activity, but the very climate they breathed. Light filtered in through high, narrow windows, falling not in broad swaths, but in shards, illuminating a hand here, a page there, as though God's gaze was selective. The daily order was precise, unwavering. The bell's first cry before dawn called them to matins, their voices rising in psalm and chant even as the sky outside was still black. Then came lauds, the praise of the coming day, though most days began under clouds or in fog so thick the horizon could not be found. After this, the hours unfurled, work in the gardens, in the kitchens, in the scriptorium. Each sister had her task, and though the work was humble, it was laced with ritual, every motion a thread in the larger tapestry of devotion. Meals were silent affairs. The only sound was the scrape of spoons and bowls, the rustle of habits, and the voice of a reader delivering a passage from Scripture or the life of a saint. In this way, even the act of eating was not a break from prayer, but a continuation of it. Conversation was permitted in designated hours, but even then, it was expected to be measured, purposeful, free from gossip or idle chatter. Yet human nature is not so easily contained. Beneath this smooth surface of discipline, currents moved, quiet rivalries, unspoken resentments, bonds of affection that bordered on attachment, suspicions that flared and faded like sparks. The abbess, keen-eyed and steady, was both shepherd and warden. She carried the responsibility of each soul under her care, but also the burden of keeping the convent's reputation unsullied before the eyes of the church and the community beyond the walls. For newcomers, the hardest adjustment was not the work or the fasting, but the silence. It pressed in from all sides, stripping away the noise of the world until only the voice inside remained. For some, this voice became clearer, more aligned with prayer. For others, it grew restless, conjuring old memories, imagined conversations, and thoughts they would never dare speak aloud. In the hours between Compline and dawn, the silence could deepen into something almost physical, a darkness that seemed to fill the corridors, lingering just beyond the reach of the candlelight. It was in this crucible of routine and quiet that she lived now. Our nun, the one whose claim would one day shake this place. In the eyes of most, she was a model sister, diligent, obedient, her voice steady in the choir, her hands deft in the work assigned. Yet there was an intensity about her that did not fade with time. Some saw it as holiness, others as a kind of watchfulness, as if she were listening for something no one else could hear. The convent structure was not just spiritual, it was political. Donations from wealthy patrons kept the roof mended and the candles burning. And in return, the nuns prayed for the souls of their benefactors. A scandal could endanger this delicate balance. The abbess knew this, and so did every woman within these walls. Thus, the unspoken rule: keep the inner life of the convent sealed, like a reliquary whose contents are never meant to be touched by uninitiated hands. And yet, there were things that could not be entirely hidden. The sudden illness of Sister, the quiet reassignment of duties after a quarrel, the small, unexplained absences that everyone noticed but no one addressed. These details were not written in any official record, but they lived in the memory of those who saw them. It was this undercurrent, the tension between the order's outward perfection and the subtle shifts beneath, that made the convent both sanctuary and pressure chamber. The spiritual life demanded total devotion, but total devotion, in its purest form, leaves little space for the self. Some women surrendered gladly, dissolving into the rhythm until their own desires seemed like distant echoes. Others resisted in ways small and invisible, lingering too long at the garden wall, letting their eyes wander to the hills beyond, allowing a forbidden book to remain hidden in a drawer. And for a few, the resistance was not entirely their own. They spoke of temptations that arrived unbidden, of thoughts that felt like intrusions, of dreams that lingered like fingerprints on the soul. The church had names for such things: distraction, temptation, obsession, possession. The boundaries between them were not always clear, even to the learned confessors. What mattered was vigilance, the readiness to root out the shadow before it could take hold. Our nun's vigilance was constant. She confessed often, perhaps more than necessary, as though by naming every stray thought she could keep herself from drifting into danger. But confession is not a shield against experience. She still felt the presence in those quiet corridors. Sometimes it seemed to brush past her, other times to stand so close behind her that she could feel the shift in the air. She told herself it was imagination, the residue of too much solitude. And yet, there were moments when it felt like the opposite, that her solitude had been broken by something that wanted her to notice. The convent itself seemed complicit in these moments. Certain corners were colder than they should have been, even in summer. A particular stretch of hallway where the candle flames wavered though no draft could be found. The chapel, beautiful in daylight, took on a strange stillness after dark, the statues of saints seeming less like guardians and more like watchers. The life inside these walls was meant to lift the soul toward the divine, but it also exposed it, stripping away the distractions that kept the darker currents at bay. And so, for those attuned to them, the boundaries between holy and unholy, real and imagined, could blur until they were indistinguishable. In such a world, the seeds of her eventual claim were already germinating. The routines, the silences, the whispered undercurrents, all these were the soil. The presence she felt, the sense of being seen in the dark, was the water. And her own nature, that deep, unyielding attentiveness, was the sunlight that would bring it all to life. From the outside, the convent was unchanging. From within, something was shifting. The bell still tolled. The prayers still rose. The work still filled the days. But in the shadows between the words of those prayers, a new story was beginning to write itself. One that, when it broke into the open, would carry the weight of both heaven and hell. There is always a night when the order of things begins to crack, though it may not be recognized for what it is until much later. For her, it came without warning, woven into the fabric of an otherwise unremarkable day. It began in the garden, as she tended the rows of rosemary and sage under the pale sun of late autumn. The air was cool, the earth damp, and the scent of crushed leaves rose under her hands. A robin darted from one branch to another, its red breast bright against the dull green. All was as it had been countless times before, and yet she felt it then, a subtle shift like the faintest tremor underfoot, not in the ground but in the space around her. The sound of the robin's wings seemed louder than it should have been, the edges of the world sharper, the colors faintly off, as though she were looking through glass, not quite clean. It passed quickly. She shook her head, blamed it on fatigue, and returned to her work. But in the days that followed, such moments returned. Sometimes it was a sudden silence in the middle of the sisters' chant, though no one else seemed to notice. Other times, the sensation of being watched from just beyond the doorway. At night, she would wake with the unshakable sense that someone had been in the room, leaving behind a faint trace of warmth in the air. She told herself these were imaginings, the mind's small rebellions against the monotony of cloistered life. But the mind, like the body, has its limits. There are hungers and fears that will not stay buried forever, and when they surface, they bring with them things that do not fit neatly into reason. The night it happened, the convent was sunk into its winter stillness. Snow had begun to fall earlier in the evening, muffling the world beyond the walls. After Compline, the sisters retired to their cells. Candles burned low. The corridors were dim. She lay on her narrow bed, hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. Sleep came slowly. She drifted between waking and dreaming, the familiar darkness of her cell folding around her like a cloak. Then, without sound, the air changed. It thickened, as if the room had drawn a deeper breath. A warmth spread across her skin, not from the wool blanket, but from something in the very space itself. Her eyes opened to the same familiar shapes, the crucifix, the small table, the faint outline of the door. But in the corner, near the place where shadow met stone, something moved. It was not sudden. It was as though the darkness itself shifted, gathering into a shape taller than a man, indistinct yet solid enough to displace the air. She tried to speak, to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure did not advance. Instead, it seemed to lean closer without moving, the space between them collapsing though neither of them stepped forward. A voice, not a sound, but a presence, filled her mind. It was not in Latin, nor in French, but in something older, a language that seemed made of meaning itself. It spoke no commands, offered no threats, yet every syllable curled in her like smoke, leaving the faint taste of ash. She could not remember the words later, only the way they made her feel, stripped bare, as though every thought and memory had been laid out and examined. She closed her eyes, but the image did not vanish. Instead, she felt it nearer, at her side now, the air warmer, the space impossibly full. A hand, human in shape, yet not human, brushed her cheek. The touch was both gentle and unyielding, like silk drawn over a blade. Her breath caught. The weight of its presence pressed her into the bed, not painfully, but with the inevitability of water filling a vessel. In that moment, there was no fear, only the profound certainty that she was no longer her own. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The air was cold again, the shadows still. She was alone. She rose, her knees unsteady, and knelt before the crucifix. Her lips formed the words of the Pater Noster, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the sensation, the soundless voice. Was it a test, a temptation, or a visitation? And if it was the latter, by whom? The next morning, she said nothing. She went about her duties as always, though her hands trembled slightly when she measured herbs or turned the pages of the Psalter. But something in her gaze had changed. The other sisters noticed without meaning to, catching it in brief glances, an intensity, a kind of listening even when no one was speaking. The nights that followed were restless. Sometimes she woke to find herself sitting upright, the candle she had not lit casting a faint glow. Once, she discovered the door to her cell ajar, though she was certain she had closed it. She began to sense the presence not only at night, but during the day, in the gardens, in the scriptorium, in the cloister walk when the winter light slanted low. It was not always oppressive. Sometimes it felt almost like companionship, a shadow at her shoulder. Other times it was overwhelming, a tide rising too fast to outrun. She began to dream of a figure standing at the edge of a vast plain under a sky without sun or stars. She would wake with the taste of iron in her mouth and the echo of words she could not translate. Weeks passed before she confided in anyone. When she did, it was to the confessor, whose lined face betrayed no reaction as she spoke. He listened, then told her such experiences were the work of the enemy, meant to lure her from her vows. She must resist with prayer, fasting, and the sacraments. She obeyed, yet the presence did not fade. If anything, it grew bolder. One night, she awoke to find the crucifix above her bed turned upside down. Another time, as she knelt in the chapel after Matins, she felt a breath at her ear, warm enough to stir the loose strands of hair beneath her veil. She turned, but there was nothing, only the faint scent of something she could not name, sweet and corrupt at once. And then came a night when it crossed the final threshold. She would later describe it as both dream and waking, both within her and outside of her. The figure came to her, not as shadow, but as form, familiar, impossibly so. Its face shifted between one she had known in the world beyond the convent and another she had never seen, yet felt she had always known. Its eyes held her, and she felt the boundaries between herself and the presence dissolve. In the morning, she could not say how much of it had been real in the way the church understood reality. But she knew this, she felt different. Her body felt different. And in the days that followed, the signs began, the small changes she could not ignore, the ones that would bring her trembling before the abbess with her claim. For now, she kept her silence. But inside her, a new life, or something that passed for life, had begun. And whether it was a miracle or a curse would depend entirely on who was asked and when. At first, the changes were subtle. So subtle she told herself they were nothing. A faint heaviness in the morning, a lingering fatigue that clung even after long hours of rest. The appetite that once found contentment in the convent's plain bread and thin soup now shifted unpredictably, vanishing for days, then returning with sudden urgency. Her hands sometimes trembled when she lifted the chalice or turned the stiff pages of the Psalter. These could be explained away as winter's toll, as the effects of fasting, of long hours in cold stone corridors. She wanted to believe that, but the body does not always accept the stories we tell ourselves. In the quiet of her cell, she began to notice her own breath differently, deeper, more deliberate, as though some other rhythm had taken hold beneath her ribs. A faint, irregular warmth seemed to pulse in her belly, not the heat of fever, but something more contained, more insistent. She pressed her palms against it once, twice, felt the slightest resistance from within, and withdrew her hands as though burned. The weeks passed, and the signs became harder to dismiss. Her habit, once loose around her waist, began to strain slightly at the seams. In the gardens, bending over the beds of herbs left her lightheaded. The long hours of kneeling in prayer sent a dull ache radiating through her back. Alone, she could admit the truth her mind resisted. Her body was changing in the way that meant new life was taking root. But to speak it aloud would mean facing the question of how. And that was the question she could not answer without tearing the world open. She began to avoid the other sister's eyes. In the refectory, she kept to the farthest end of the bench. She took her turn in the kitchens and the laundry, but asked for lighter duties, feigning illness. A few noticed. One novice remarked that her cheeks seemed fuller, her skin strangely luminous despite the winter. Another whispered that she had seen her wince as though from a kick beneath the ribs. Such whispers are quick to multiply in a place where silence is law. Soon, even those who had noticed nothing began to look at her differently. When the abbess finally summoned her, she entered the small stone office with her heart thudding in her ears. The abbess's eyes were steady, her voice even. She asked the question with no preamble, no softening. And in that moment, the choice before her became stark. She could claim sin and face the shame and punishment for breaking her vows, or she could speak the truth as she knew it, truth that would damn her in another way entirely. She chose the latter. The words left her mouth almost without her will guiding them. The father of this child, she said, was no man. He came to her in the night, in form and presence beyond human, and left her with this. She did not weep, did not beg to be believed. She spoke as one stating a fact carved in stone. The abbess did not speak for a long moment. Then she crossed herself slowly, as though the gesture might draw an unseen line of defense in the air between them. She told her to remain in her cell until she was called for, and that no one was to speak to her without the abbess's permission. That night, the convent did not feel the same. There was an unspoken knowledge hanging over the cloister, a weight in the air heavier than the cold. Some avoided her altogether. Others stole glances, as though trying to detect the mark of the unholy on her skin. In the chapel, she felt the prayers shift, not words of unity, but of protection against her. The body's changes quickened. The swell at her abdomen grew undeniable. She felt the small, strange movements within, first like the flutter of wings, then like the slow turning of something aware. Sometimes she thought she could hear it, a faint echoing pulse that did not match her own heartbeat. It was not only the child that altered her body. Her senses seemed sharper, almost painfully so. The scent of incense in the chapel was overwhelming, the texture of wool against her skin almost abrasive. Her dreams came thick and vivid, often of firelight and shadow, of hands reaching toward her in a place without walls. She woke from them drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around her as though she had struggled against something in the night. The abbess, bound by both duty and fear, summoned a physician. He arrived with the caution of one approaching a dangerous animal, examining her with hands that trembled slightly despite his attempt at composure. When he left, his face was pale. He told the abbess the pregnancy was unlike any he had seen, but refused to elaborate. He would not return. A midwife was brought in secret days later. She muttered prayers under her breath as she worked, touching the swell of the nun's belly with quick, light hands. She too remarked on the strangeness, the unusual position of the child, the unnatural warmth of the skin. When pressed, she simply said, "This is not for me to deliver," and left before nightfall. Isolation deepened. She was excused from communal duties entirely, her meals brought to her cell. The sisters assigned to tend to her did so in silence, avoiding her gaze. Even the confessor began to speak to her through the door rather than entering. Yet she was not entirely alone. In the stillness of those nights, she felt the presence more vividly than ever. It seemed to circle her, to stand at the foot of her bed, to lean close enough that she could feel the shift of air against her skin. Sometimes she thought she could see it in the corner of her vision, a flicker of movement, a distortion in the candlelight. In the child, it was not passive. There were moments when it seemed to respond to the presence, to stir as if in recognition. Once, after a particularly vivid dream, she woke to find her hands gripping the edge of the mattress, her breath ragged, the child shifting beneath her ribs as though trying to push outward. The abbess began to keep the chapel lit through the night, ordering prayers for the convent's protection. She spoke little to the others of the exact nature of the situation, but fear is fluent even in silence. The older sisters recalled tales from their youth of infants born with strange marks, of women who swore their children were not their husbands, but the spawn of something darker. Most of those tales ended in the same way, swift burial or worse. Outside the walls, rumors leaked. The baker's apprentice swore he had seen a cloaked figure slipping through the convent's garden at night. A shepherd claimed he had heard a woman's voice singing on the hill above the convent long after the gates were shut. These stories were whispered in the taverns and at the market, growing with each telling. Inside, the tension coiled tighter with each passing day. She could feel it in the way the sisters' footsteps quickened when they passed her cell, in the way their prayers seemed to catch and falter when her name appeared in the litany. And within herself, she felt the duality sharpening, the pull toward the child as any mother might feel, and the shadowed knowledge that this child's existence was an affront to everything she had sworn to serve. Her body was no longer entirely hers. It was a vessel for something that drew both life and fear from everyone who came near. And in the still hours before dawn, when the convent was silent and the air hung heavy, she sometimes wondered whether she herself had become the battlefield the confessor once warned her about, a place where two forces met, neither willing to yield, and where the outcome would be decided not in the heavens, but here, in the fragile flesh of her own body. The wall of silence could not hold forever. Rumor has a way of swelling until it presses against every door, seeping through cracks no key can lock. By the turn of winter, what had been a guarded secret inside the convent was now a matter of whispered certainty beyond its walls. In the town below, the market stalls hummed with talk of a nun carrying a child not sired by any man. Some spoke of scandal, others of blasphemy, others still of a dark miracle. The abbess could no longer ignore it. To remain silent was to invite the risk of the convent being accused of harboring sin, or worse, heresy. And so she sent word to the diocese, requesting the presence of church officials to investigate the circumstances with the utmost discretion. Discretion, however, was not something these matters were known for. The church was a vast organism, and when one nerve was touched, the tremor ran the length of its body. They arrived in the second week of January. 3 men, cloaked against the cold, their faces pale from the wind and set with the stillness of those who believe they already know the truth. One was a canon lawyer, skilled in the rules that bound both clergy and laity. Another was a theologian, versed in the writings of Augustine, Aquinas, and the many grim treatises on the nature of demonic influence. The third was a confessor appointed by the bishop himself, a man whose eyes seemed to weigh the soul like a coin in the hand. Their arrival was felt immediately. The rhythm of the convent shifted, its silence now edged with the knowledge that every step, every glance, every word might be noted, interpreted, and written into some official record. The sisters moved more carefully. Conversations, already rare, shrank into murmurs behind closed doors. She was summoned to meet them in the chapter house, a small, cold chamber where the walls themselves seemed to listen. The men sat at a long table, their black robes pooling around them like shadows. She stood before them, the swell of her belly undeniable now, her hands folded at her waist. They began with questions about her past, her conduct, her health. Then came the sharper edge. How did she explain her condition? She told them what she had told the abbess, that the father of a child was no man, but the figure who had come to her in the night. She described the first presence, the warmth in the air, the voice in a language she could not name. She spoke of the touch that was both gentle and inescapable. They did not interrupt, but their pens scratched on the parchment, each word a potential charge against her. When she finished, there was silence. Then the theologian asked if she had been dreaming. She said no. Had she, perhaps, been deceived by a man in disguise? No. Was she certain this presence was not an angel? She hesitated, not from doubt, but from the awareness that the wrong answer could condemn her more surely than silence. She said only, it was not holy. The confessor's gaze did not waver. He asked about her prayers, her fasts, her private thoughts in the weeks before the visitation. She answered truthfully, though she could hear in his tone the suggestion that such piety might have been pride, a door through which the tempter could slip. When they dismissed her, it was with the promise, or threat, that they would return with more questions. The abbess escorted her back to her cell without a word. The investigation deepened. The sisters were questioned individually, asked about her behavior, her visions, any strange occurrences. Some spoke cautiously, unwilling to be drawn into judgment. Others, perhaps from fear or from their own unease, recalled moments when she had seemed apart from the rest, when her gaze had fixed on something no one else could see. A few mentioned the sulfur scent in the chapel, the strange flicker of candlelight when she entered. These details, once only fragments of private unease, were now threaded together into a tapestry of suspicion. And suspicion, in this era, was not a thing to be taken lightly. For every unexplained mark on her life, there was a text, a precedent, a case from years past in which such signs were interpreted as the fingerprints of the demonic. They brought her to the chapel for examination, not of the body, but of the spirit. Prayers of exorcism were read aloud, the Latin echoing against the stone. Holy water was sprinkled on her forehead. She did not flinch, but her eyes closed tightly, as if bracing against a sound only she could hear. When the confessor pressed the crucifix into her hands, she held it firmly, though later one of the officials would note that her palms had sweated enough to leave the metal faintly damp. There were tests the church used in such cases. Not the grotesque torments of witch trials, but subtler probes. They left relics in her cell to see if she would react, asked her to recite prayers backward to observe her composure, introduced theological traps into conversation to test her discernment. She passed, most without incident, but there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when something flickered in her expression, as though she were hearing a second conversation beneath the first. Outside her presence, the men argued. Some believed she was a liar, perhaps to conceal a mortal sin, her story a convenient shield against the harsher penalties for breaking her vows. Others, more grimly, believed her claim, that she was indeed carrying something unholy, and saw in it a dangerous precedent that must be crushed. Word of the inquiry spread beyond the town, carried by merchants and travelers to the next villages, then further still. In taverns, the story changed shape. In one telling she was a saint resisting temptation, in another she was already damned. In both, the child she carried became the object of fascination, a vessel for prophecy or disaster. The pressure mounted inside the convent. The sisters began to avoid her entirely, their fear of contamination, whether spiritual or reputational, overpowering the bonds of their shared vows. She ate alone. She prayed alone. Even the abbess now seemed more a jailer than a guide. Her visits brief, her eyes averted. The officials spoke of a decision to be made before the birth. Some urged seclusion until the child was delivered, then immediate baptism, on the chance it could be saved, and if signs of deformity appeared, a swift burial without public display. Others, darker in their counsel, suggested more drastic measures, that the child should not be allowed to draw breath at all, lest it live to carry out some infernal purpose. She knew these discussions were happening. She could read it in their faces when they came to question her, in the way they glanced at her stomach, as if they could see the shape of destiny beneath her habit. And though fear gnawed at her, there was another emotion taking root alongside it, a fierce, inexplicable resolve. This child, whatever it was, belonged to her in a way nothing else ever had. The trial was not a single day, but a series of confrontations, spoken, unspoken, physical, spiritual. And though the church's machinery moved with the slowness of a great beast, she could feel its weight gathering above her, ready to descend. The only uncertainty was whether it would crush her or the thing she carried. First, in the last week of their inquiry, the officials summoned her once more, this time to stand not before 3, but before 7. Torches lit the chapter house, casting long shadows on the walls. A parchment was read aloud, detailing her testimony, the accounts of the sisters, the theological conclusions drawn from them. When it was done, the confessor asked her directly, "Do you renounce what you carry if it is not of God?" Her answer was silence. In that silence, she felt the presence again, near, listening, almost approving. And in the faces of the men before her, she saw the decision forming. The next phase would not be inquiry. It would be judgment. And judgment, in matters such as this, rarely came without fire. The decision was never written in words she was meant to read. It came instead in the shifting of behavior, in the way the abbess began to watch her more closely, in the quiet arrival of additional midwives and priests at the convent. She understood, without being told, that the moment the child drew breath, it would be taken from her. Whether for baptism, burial, or destruction, she could not be certain. All she knew was that her time with it was dwindling. The nights grew longer. February's cold seeped into every stone, and the convent's corridors seemed darker than before, as if the light itself avoided certain places. In her cell, she felt the child moving, sometimes gently, sometimes with a force that made her catch her breath. There were moments when the movements seemed to answer her thoughts, as though the small life within could hear her. At times she spoke softly to it, not in prayer, but in a low murmur, as a mother might speak to an infant already in her arms. The presence had not gone. If anything, it had grown nearer, as though anticipating the moment of arrival. She felt it most in the hours just before dawn, when the world outside the convent still slept. The air would grow heavy, her skin prickling with a warmth that was not from the thin blanket over her. Once, she thought she saw the faint outline of a figure at the foot of her bed, so still that for a moment she wondered if it was carved from shadow itself. The day began like any other, with the tolling of the bell, with prayers mumbled through tired lips. She moved more slowly now, excused from most duties, allowed to rest. But by midday, a tight ache began to curl low in her abdomen, rhythmic, insistent. She knew, though she had never done this before, what it meant. The abbess was told. The midwives were summoned. The priests took their places in the adjoining chapel, their prayers rising steadily, as if to hold back whatever unseen force might be circling. Candles were lit in her cell, their flames bending slightly as though to an invisible current. The pains grew sharper, closer together. Sweat dampened her veil. One of the midwives wiped her forehead, murmuring words meant to soothe, though her eyes betrayed the fear she carried. The air smelled of tallow, linen, and something metallic beneath it, faint but undeniable. Time began to dissolve. There was only the rhythm of pain and release, the sound of her own breath, the murmur of voices that sometimes seemed far away. Between contractions, she thought she heard another sound beneath it all, like the hum of a low chant in a language no one in the room spoke. The child came slowly. Hours passed. The candles burned low. The midwives worked with practiced efficiency, yet their hands moved more cautiously than usual, as though they feared what they might touch. The priests in the next room continued their prayers, voices hoarse but unbroken. And then, after a final, searing effort, it happened. A thin, wet cry filled the room, startling in its suddenness. The midwife nearest her froze for a moment before cutting the cord. She did not hand the child to its mother. Instead, she glanced toward the abbess, who nodded once. The infant was wrapped in linen and carried swiftly to the priests. She caught only a glimpse, dark hair matted to a small head, eyes that impossibly seemed to lock on hers in that brief instant. Something passed between them then, something she could not name. Neither entirely love nor entirely fear, but both braided tightly together. From the other room came the splash of water, the hurried Latin of baptism, the answering cry of the child. And then silence, the kind that carries weight. When a midwife returned, her hands were empty. She said nothing. The abbess came to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It is done," she said. "Nothing more." The hours after the birth blurred. She lay still, her body aching, her mind reaching into the space where the child had been. No one spoke of what would happen next. She did not ask, but deep in the marrow of her being, she knew the story was not finished. Not for her, not for the child, not for the convent that had tried to contain them. That night, as she drifted in and out of shallow sleep, she felt the presence once more, not in the room, but inside her, as if it had passed through her body and left something behind that was more than memory. She heard no words, yet she understood the message. This is not the end. In the quiet darkness, with the convent around her sleeping, she believed it. Morning in the convent came as it always did, with the thin light of dawn filtering through narrow windows and the tolling of the bell. But that morning, the sound carried differently. It was not the clear, steady peal of routine, but something muted, as though the air itself resisted its reach. For her, lying weak beneath her blanket, the world felt distant, like a room viewed through a half-closed door. The child was gone. No footsteps, no cries. Only the faint ache in her body, the soreness that lingered in every limb, reminded her it had been there at all. She could almost convince herself it had been a dream. Except she could still remember the brief weight of its gaze, the impossible sharpness of that connection. The abbess visited just after prime, her expression composed, but her eyes tight with something unspoken. She said the child had been baptized, that it had gone to God. The words hung in the air, too carefully chosen. She did not say the child had died. She did not say it had lived. She said only that it had gone, as though the movement between worlds required no explanation. In the days that followed, her cell became a place of confinement rather than recovery. She was told she needed rest, but she knew it was to keep her apart from the others. Meals were brought and left at the threshold. The only visitors were the abbess and, once, the confessor, who prayed over her without meeting her eyes. The silence of the convent was no longer the silence she had known before. Now it was weighted, brittle, broken only by the faint, accidental echoes of her own breath. And beneath it was something else, a hum, faint but constant, as though the air in her cell carried a memory of the presence that had stood there before. Rumors spread beyond the walls. The town's gossip shifted from speculation to certainty. The child had been born with strange marks, or with eyes that never closed, or with a voice that did not cry but laughed. Each telling added something new, until the story became less about the woman in the convent and more about the monstrous or miraculous thing she had brought into the world. For the sisters inside, the event was not spoken of directly, yet lived in their glances. Some looked at her with pity, others with suspicion, a few with a fear they did not bother to disguise. In the chapel, when her name was read in the litany of prayers, there was a brief, perceptible pause, as though the sound itself hesitated before passing her lips into the air. One night, unable to sleep, she rose and went to the narrow window of her cell. The moon was thin and low. Beyond the convent walls, the hills lay dark, the village below scattered with pinpricks of firelight. And then, faint but certain, she heard it, a sound from the far side of the garden wall. It was not the cry of an infant, too deep, too measured. Yet there was something in it that made her heart lurch in recognition. She pressed her hand to the stone, leaning toward the night as if it might yield its secrets. In the days after, she began to notice other signs. The candles in the chapel sputtered when she entered. A faint scent, sweet, corrupted, lingered after she prayed alone. And once, as she bent over the altar cloth, a drop of wax fell on her hand, burning her skin. Yet she had felt no pain until she saw it. The abbess, perhaps sensing the current of unease growing again, summoned her to speak. She told her that the bishop had decreed she would remain in the convent for life, that she would not be permitted to travel, and that her contact with the outside world would be limited to confession and supervised correspondence. It was a sentence without trial, wrapped in the language of spiritual care. She accepted it without argument. In truth, she had nowhere else to go. But inside, something resisted, not with the rebellion of a prisoner, but with the patient endurance of a seed under frozen soil. The presence was not gone. Whatever bond had been formed in the night of the visitation, whatever tie had been sealed in the moment of the child's birth, still remained. The curse, if that is what it was, did not lie in the child alone. It was in the knowing, in the memory of a reality that ran alongside the one the church claimed as truth, in the awareness that there were doors between worlds, and that one of them had opened to her, never to fully close again. And in the long hours of the night, when the convent slept and the air grew still, she would sometimes feel that hum again, not in her cell, not in the air, but within herself. It was not grief alone. It was not fear alone. It was the certainty that something was waiting, and she began to wonder, was the curse that the child had been taken, or that one day it might return? Time does not erase all things, it reshapes them. The story of the nun and her forbidden child did not vanish overnight. It thinned, like smoke and wind, leaving only a faint trace of its scent. Within the convent walls, the memory was deliberately folded away. The abbess ordered her name struck from certain records, replaced with initials or omitted entirely. The birth was never mentioned in the official chronicle of the house, as though a year had passed with nothing of consequence. She remained there, year after year, moving through the cloisters like a ghost still bound to the living. She kept the hours, did her work, sang the psalms. Her voice, once clear and steady, grew softer, less distinct. For the novices who joined later, she was simply one of the older sisters, her story unknown, her eyes carrying something unreadable. Outside, the decades rolled forward. The town changed. New roofs, new names, new rumors. The story of a nun who had given birth to something not entirely human survived only in fragments, passed down like a dangerous relic, reshaped to fit the needs of the teller. In some versions, she was a saint who had endured the devil's assault and triumphed. In others, she was a witch in a nun's veil, spared the pyre only by the abbess's intervention. But in the parchment vaults of the diocese, a few surviving documents told a stranger, more ambiguous story. Marginal notes in the hand of a canon lawyer, describing the matter of the sister with the unexplained conception. A letter from a midwife, and signed, "Speaking of eyes unlike any I have seen," set in a head too still for a child newly born. And a final report, brief and cautious, concluding that the incident should be regarded as resolved, without specifying what resolution had been reached. Centuries are long enough for truth to calcify into legend. By the late 18th century, her name, if it was hers at all, appeared in a single book of local lore, misdated and half fictionalized, alongside tales of spectral monks and haunted wells. The details were wrong. The year, the order of the nuns, the fate of the child. Yet the core remained. The idea of a woman bound by vows who had borne something the church could not fully acknowledge. The convent itself endured, though the centuries thinned its numbers. Wars passed near, but did not breach its walls. Famine emptied the town below, yet the sisters kept their gardens alive. Revolution threatened to strip the church of its holdings, but the convent's remoteness saved it. Through it all, she remained until her death, unmarked by scandal in the records, her burial place indistinguishable from the others in the small graveyard behind the chapel. But sometimes, a visitor walking among those graves claimed to feel watched. A coldness, they said, that settled on the skin even in summer. A sudden stillness, as if the air itself remembered something it could not speak. By the 19th century, her story was almost gone. The archivists who encountered those scattered notes found them puzzling, but insignificant. Scholars of ecclesiastical history dismissed them as the byproducts of superstition, no more credible than the visions of saints who claimed to see the Virgin in clouds or the faces of demons in candle smoke. And yet, the whispers never vanished entirely. In the late 1800s, a folklorist collecting stories from the region heard an old woman speak of the sister who bore the devil's son, her voice dropping with the weight of the words. The old woman claimed the child had not died, that it had been taken away by a man in a long cloak the night after it was born, and that he had been seen years later in another town, grown to manhood, yet unchanged in the eyes from the night of his birth. No one could confirm it. The records were silent. But silence is not always absence. It can be protection, concealment, or fear. And in the way the woman had spoken, the folklorists sensed that she believed every word. The 20th century brought other dangers to memory. Wars burned archives, bombed churches, scattered communities. Stories like hers were too fragile to survive the machinery of modern destruction. What remained were only the bones, a name without certainty, a date without proof, and the enduring human fascination with what lies beyond the boundary of the known. In the convent, now diminished to a handful of aging sisters, the tale of her life is not told. But in the oldest part of the cloister, one narrow corridor bears a peculiarity. The stone at its center is darker than the rest, as though touched by fire long ago. When asked, the sisters say nothing. Yet those who have walked it alone sometimes claim to hear a faint hum, like a voice just beyond hearing. Perhaps the truest silence is not the one that follows forgetting, but the one that follows knowing too much. For if her story is gone from history, it is not gone from the place itself. Stones remember, air remembers, and somewhere in the deep, unlit chamber of time, where all human stories eventually sink, hers waits, not erased, but sleeping, ready for the moment when someone, somewhere, asks the question again. What became of the nun who claimed the devil made her pregnant? Centuries pass, and what was once immediate becomes distant, the sharp edges of fact worn down by time until only the shape remains. We do not know her true face, not the sound of her voice, not the exact words she spoke when she stood before the abbess and made her impossible claim. And yet, her presence remains unfixed, unmeasurable, and stubborn as the shadow of a figure long vanished from the room. Stories like hers refuse to vanish entirely because they feed on the same hunger that has always lived in us. The need to believe that the ordinary world is not all there is, that behind the familiar there's a deeper chamber, where rules loosen and the unthinkable becomes possible. The church may have tried to seal her away in silence, and history may have obliged by losing her in its labyrinth, but silence has a way of sounding different to those who listen closely. Her story is not only about the question of whether it happened, but about why it mattered so much that it could not be allowed to remain whole. A woman bound by vows brings forth a child and claims the devil as its father. This was never just a scandal of flesh. It was a wound to the architecture of certainty, a reminder that belief is not the same as control. To the church, she was both danger and opportunity. Danger, because if she was telling the truth, then the devil had crossed the last threshold, corrupting even the sanctity of the cloister. Opportunity, because if she was lying, her punishment could stand as a warning, a reminder to others that the vows they took were not mere words, but chains, forged to hold them even when the soul strained against them. And yet, there's another possibility, that she was neither liar nor victim of the demonic, but something else entirely. A woman who experienced a rupture in the boundary between the seen and unseen, and who could only describe it in the language her world had given her. In her time, that language was the devil. Today, we might choose other words: trauma, ecstasy, hallucination, visitation, intrusion. But language does not dissolve reality. It only reframes it. It is tempting to think of her as singular, as if her life was an anomaly. But history, if you know where to look, is threaded with women whose lives bent toward the strange. Visionaries who claimed angels visited them in the night. Healers whose touch was feared as much as sought. Mothers of children whose origins were whispered about in markets and behind closed doors. Some were exalted, some were burned, most were forgotten. Her fate was neither exaltation nor flame. It was slow erasure. That is its own kind of cruelty, to live on without being permitted to be fully known. And so she became something liminal, not myth, not fact, suspended in the air like breath in winter. We do not know what happened to the child. Perhaps it died as they claimed. Perhaps it lived in some hidden place, growing into a life of anonymity or notoriety. Perhaps it was ordinary in body, but not in fate, carrying something of that night in its marrow, passing it on in ways too subtle for record or ritual to capture. Even if the child vanished, the idea of it did not. It became a kind of invisible relic, passed from one mind to another, altered in shape, but not in essence. And the idea was dangerous. It asked questions that could not be answered without loosening the bolts on the doors the church kept shut. What if the sacred can be breached? What if the enemy can wear the mask of the divine? And most unsettling, what if such unions are not always forced, but chosen? We will never be certain of her truth, but certainty may not be the point. In the centuries since, her story has functioned as both warning and invitation. Warning, because it suggests that devotion is no shield against intrusion. Invitation, because it hints at a world where the boundaries we think are absolute are, in fact, porous. Even now, when belief has been diluted by modern skepticism, her story works on us. It refuses to settle into a single shape. Some will hear it and think of possession. Others will think of political scapegoating, of how institutions consume inconvenient people to preserve their image. Still others will think of the unrecorded inner lives of women, of how those lives sometimes break the surface in ways the world is not prepared to receive. In the end, she is both less and more than the story we have told. Less, because much of it is invention built to fill the silence. More, because she has become a vessel for things larger than herself. Fear, desire, the human craving for explanation in the face of the inexplicable. If she could speak now, across the gulf of centuries, perhaps she would not offer us answers at all. Perhaps she would only stand in the threshold between our world and whatever she touched and remind us that some doors, once opened, never close. That the presence we deny does not vanish, it waits. And perhaps that is the final truth of her life. Not the birth, not the child, not the investigation, but the fact that once the story entered the world, it could not be undone. It could be buried, misremembered, transformed, but not undone. It survives in the memory of stone, in the hum of air in empty corridors, in the way even now we lean forward to hear more, as if by listening long enough we might catch the echo of that first impossible claim. She is gone. The convent has changed. The records are dust. But the question remains, and will remain for as long as we find ourselves drawn to the edges of what we know. What did she see in the shadows that night? And what, in the dark hours after, saw her back?